He signed the divorce papers without looking at her once. She left without telling him she was carrying his child. 5 years later, a little girl with his eyes stood in the middle of a war zone, and neither of them was ready for what came next. The papers were already warm from his hands by the time they reached her side of the table. Evelyn Hart didn't move right away. She sat with both palms flat against the polished mahogany, feeling the cold bleed up through her skin, and she looked at the document the way you look at something that was always going to end you. Not with surprise, but with the particular exhaustion of a person who spent years pretending it wouldn't. The penthouse was 52 floors above Chicago. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled in every direction under a February sky, so heavy and colorless it looked like concrete. Snow had been threatening since morning. It never came. The clouds just sat there, pressing down. Ronan Viscari stood at the window with his back to her. He was still holding the pen. He hadn't looked at her once since she walked in. That was the thing Evelyn would carry longest. Not the papers, not the lawyers, not the cold precision of the language inside the document that reduced 11 years to settlement terms and asset division. It was the way he stood there with his back to her, his shoulders straight, his spine military rigid, staring out at a city that belonged to him in every way that mattered, and simply refused to turn around. Ronan. He didn't answer. Ronan, look at me. A pause, the kind that has weight, the kind you feel in your sternum. Sign the papers, Evelyn. His voice was what it always was. Low, controlled, ground down, smooth like Riverstone. The voice of a man who had learned early that volume was for people who hadn't yet figured out how to make silence do the work instead. Evelyn had loved that voice once. She had pressed her ear against his chest in the dark and let it move through her like something medicinal. Now it felt like a door being locked from the other side. You owe me an explanation. I owe you a clean exit. He still didn't turn. That is what I am giving you. That is not what I am asking for. The pen clicked once in his hand. He set it on the windowsill and finally turned, and Evelyn felt the old familiar brace go through her. The instinct, after 11 years, to prepare herself for the full force of him. Ronan Viscari at 41 was not a softened version of anything. He was broad through the jaw and narrow through the eyes with a kind of face that had been arranged by hard years into something that read as handsome from a distance and dangerous up close. The scar along his left temple, a thin white line he never explained and she never pushed, caught the gray afternoon light. His suit was charcoal, no tie. He looked like a man who had already said his goodbyes before she arrived. You know what I am, he said. I have always known what you are. Then you know this is the only way I keep you breathing. Evelyn felt something hot move through her chest. Not anger, not exactly. Something older and more complicated than anger. You don't get to make that decision for me. I made it. Flat, final, the verdict delivered, and the gavel already down. Sign the papers. 3 weeks ago you were talking about. 3 weeks ago was a different calculation. His eyes moved to the document on the table. The calculation changed. What changed it? Nothing. Silence so complete she could hear the hiss of the forced air heating through the ceiling vents above her. Ronan, what changed it? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for just a moment, something shifted behind the controlled surface of his expression. Something she recognized, something that looked for half a second like grief. Then it closed off again, a shutter coming down, a room going dark. If you love me, he said quietly, you will sign the papers and you will leave Chicago tonight. Don't look back. Don't contact anyone connected to me. Don't use your credit cards for at least a month. He paused. There is a bag packed for you in the bedroom. Cash, documentation, everything you need. Evelyn's stomach dropped. He had already packed her bag. He had already made arrangements. He hadn't told her. He hadn't asked. He had decided in the way that Ronan Viscari decided everything. Unilaterally, completely, with the assumption that the decision was his alone to make. And he had packed her a bag and arranged documentation. And now he was standing at a window in his charcoal suit, waiting for her to comply. She picked up the pen. She told herself it was because she understood. She told herself it was because she trusted him. Because she had always understood the world they lived in. Because she was not naive about what his enemies were capable of, and what it might cost her to remain attached to his name. She told herself a lot of things in those seconds. She wasn't sure later how many of them were true. She signed. He turned back to the window. "The car is downstairs," he said. "Marcus will take you to the airport." She stood there for another moment, waiting for something. She was not sure what, a word, a movement toward her. Some small evidence that she had mattered beyond the strategic inconvenience of her continued proximity to him. She waited long enough to understand that nothing was coming. Then she picked up her coat from the chair, and she walked to the elevator, and she rode it down 52 floors without crying, which she considered later one of the greater achievements of her life. She did not go to the airport. She did not get into Marcus's car. She walked 4 blocks through the February cold with her coat unbuttoned because she needed to feel something real against her skin. And she stood at the edge of the Chicago River with the brown water moving sluggishly below her. And she breathed. She breathed, and she thought about the things she had not told him. The things she had been trying to find the right moment to say for 3 weeks. And the right moment had never come, because the moments kept shifting, and the world they lived in kept intervening. And now the moment was gone along with everything else. 8 weeks. She was 8 weeks pregnant. The wind off the river came in hard and cold. Evelyn stood there and let it hit her face, and she made a decision. Not slowly, not with lengthy deliberation, but with the sudden crystalline clarity of a person who understands that she is completely alone, and that alone is what she is going to have to be. She was not going to tell him. She was going to disappear. Not because she was afraid of Ronan, not exactly, but because she had just watched him pack her a bag and arrange her exit and sign those papers without a single tremor in his hand. And she understood fully and finally that she would never be more important to him than the empire he was running. And she would not let her child grow up knowing what that felt like from the inside. She would not let them be used. She would not let them be leveraged. She would not let another person look at her child someday and see only what they could take. She turned away from the river. She had somewhere to be. The clinic was a single-story building near Pilsen with peeling paint on the exterior and a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and wet dog. Evelyn had worked there for 4 years, longer than she had been in any one place before residency had finally settled her in Chicago. Longer than she had been attached to anything except Ronan. Dr. Castillo was already gone for the evening. The overnight tech, a 22-year-old named Priya, who wore her hair in a braid and never asked unnecessary questions, was checking on post-surgical animals in the back when Evelyn let herself in. She went to the break room. She sat down at the small table with the uneven leg, and she opened her phone. She had 6 contacts she trusted. After she thought about it carefully, the way you think about things when the stakes have finally become clear, she reduced that to 2, then to 1. A woman named Maggie Croft, who had been her roommate in veterinary school, who now lived in Portland, who had married someone boring and stable and kind, and who had never once crossed paths with anything connected to the Viscari name. Evelyn sent her a text. "I need a favor, the kind you don't ask questions about." Maggie responded in 11 minutes. "Tell me what you need." This was why Evelyn had chosen her. Over the next 4 hours, sitting in the break room of a veterinary clinic in Pilsen, while Priya moved quietly around the building behind her, Evelyn Hart dismantled her own life. She was methodical about it. She had, in her years adjacent to Ronan's world, absorbed more practical knowledge about disappearing than she had ever intended to. The way you absorb things by proximity, by overhearing the wrong conversations, by asking a careful question at the right moment, and filing the answer away in some back room of your mind where you hoped you would never need it. Cash first. She emptied her personal accounts. Not the joint accounts, not anything Ronan's people had access to, just the accounts she had maintained under her own name since before they married. $11,000. Not enough, but a start. Then the phone. She removed the SIM card and left the phone in the break room drawer. Maggie would wire money to a pickup location. Not digital, physical. A friend of a friend in a city Evelyn had never visited. Then identity. This was the harder part. The part that took longer. She knew a name. A document forger who operated out of Wicker Park. A man who had no affiliation with Ronan's network, but who existed in the same gray margins. A man she had encountered exactly once at a dinner she had attended with Ronan 3 years prior, and whose name she had remembered because she was always remembering things in case she needed them. She walked to Wicker Park. It was past 11. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. She didn't care. The man's name was Decker. He opened the door of his apartment, above a closed laundromat, and looked at her for a long moment without expression, and she told him what she needed, and he named a price. She gave him most of the cash in her coat pocket. He told her to come back in the morning. She walked back out into the cold. She found a 24-hour diner on Milwaukee Avenue and ordered coffee she didn't drink and sat in a booth by the window and watched the street. At 3 in the morning, she went to the bathroom and locked the door and sat on the closed lid of the toilet and pressed both hands flat against her stomach and stayed very still. 8 weeks, a heartbeat the size of a hummingbird. "I am sorry," she said quietly to the empty bathroom, to the flickering fluorescent light above her, to the child she could not yet feel, but who she was already rearranging everything for. "I am going to make this work." She sat there for a long time. Then she washed her face, dried it on paper towels, and went back to the booth. Decker delivered at 7 the next morning. A passport, a driver's license, a social security card with a number she memorized immediately, a name she had never answered to before. Claire Winters. She repeated it to herself on the walk back to the diner. Claire Winters. Claire Winters. By the time she sat down with a second coffee she didn't drink, it had started to feel like hers. She left Chicago by bus. Not because it was the most efficient option, but because buses were cash. Buses were anonymous. Buses didn't require showing documentation that had existed long enough to be in any system Ronan's people might eventually access. She took the first bus to Detroit. From Detroit, she took another to Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, she stopped at a pharmacy and bought a box of hair dye. And in a gas station bathroom outside of the city, she bleached her dark auburn hair to a pale ash blonde that made her look like a different person's sister. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Evelyn Hart had dark red hair and an apartment in Lincoln Park and a husband who packed her bags without telling her. Claire Winters had pale hair and nothing and was going to be fine. She picked up her bag and got on the next bus. She spent 4 months moving, a pattern she established intuitively without conscious strategy through some combination of instinct and the survival arithmetic of a person who had lived long enough near dangerous things to understand their geometry. Never more than 3 weeks in one city. Always cash. Always second-floor rooms with fire escapes. Always veterinary clinics because she knew the work, because they were everywhere. Because animal people were generally good people who didn't ask many questions and were grateful for competent help and paid in cash without thinking too much about it. Baltimore, Philadelphia. Halifax briefly, which was cold in a way Chicago cold wasn't, maritime and relentless and deeply indifferent to human suffering. Providence, Montreal, a town in rural Ontario whose name she couldn't spell, where she worked for 3 weeks at a large animal practice and slept in a room above the barn and woke each morning to the sound of horses shifting in their stalls below her. Her body changed. She bought clothes that accommodated the change. She was careful and she was exhausted, and she was more alone than she had ever been in her life. And she was also in some way she couldn't fully explain more herself than she had been in years. She thought about Ronan every day. This was not a choice. It was simply what happened. She thought about the set of his shoulders at the window, the controlled voice, the pen clicking once before he set it down, the bag he had packed for her, sitting on the bed in the penthouse bedroom, thoughtful and complete. It was the most unforgivable thing he had ever done to her, because it meant he had planned her erasure before she even walked into that room. She also thought at 2 in the morning in various unfamiliar beds about the other things. The way he had looked at her, sometimes across rooms, across tables, across years, was something she had no better word for than intensity, which was an inadequate word for it, but the only one she had. The way he had held her once in a hospital waiting room in the 3rd year of their marriage. When her mother was in surgery, and the surgery was going badly, and he had put his arm around her without saying anything and kept it there for 4 hours. She thought about his hands. She thought about his silences, which she had learned to read the way you learn another language, slowly, imperfectly, with a persistent sense that fluency was perpetually just out of reach. She stopped thinking about it, or she tried to. She got better at trying. She crossed into Europe in June through Dublin, with the passport Decker had built her. The border agent glanced at Claire Winters for 3 seconds and stamped her through. On the other side, Evelyn stood on European soil for the first time in her life and breathed the different air and thought, "This is it now. This is where you start." She was 29 years old and 7 months pregnant, and she had $5,000 in a money belt under her shirt. And she did not look back. Paris first, then Lyon, then a southward drift through Italy that slowed in Florence, where the animal clinic on the Viaz had a notice in the window asking for part-time help. She stayed 6 weeks, long enough to learn some Italian, long enough to feel her daughter move for the first time with a kick like a small, insistent fist. A daughter she had known for months, but she still wasn't used to it. She wasn't used to the pronoun, the specificity of it, the way it made the abstraction suddenly real and irreversible. A daughter, a girl who would have Ronan's blood in her, half of the whole of her composed of a man Evelyn was trying to forget. A girl who would grow up asking questions Evelyn didn't have clean answers to. She moved on from Florence, through the Austrian Alps, through Vienna briefly, where the November cold arrived early and sharp, and she could no longer outpace the weight of what was coming. She needed to stop. She needed to find somewhere that felt, if not safe, then at least stable. Somewhere she could put down temporary roots and do the thing that was approximately 6 weeks away now. Somewhere with good hospitals and competent midwives, and the kind of anonymity that came from being one foreign face among many. Prague. She arrived on a gray morning in late November, with the city just beginning its descent into winter. The river was high and fast and dark under a low sky. The Baroque facades of the old city rose up in their rust and ochre and faded gold, beautiful and indifferent. The beauty of a place that has survived enough centuries to have stopped paying attention to individual human stories. She stood on the Charles Bridge in the cold and looked at the gargoyles and the statues and the low clouds moving over the castle, and she thought, yes, here. She found a small apartment in a neighborhood that was gritty and real and cheap. And she found a midwife through a community board at an expat clinic. And she found a job at a small veterinary practice, 3 blocks from her apartment, run by a cheerful Czech veterinarian who asked no questions and paid in cash and liked that she had strong hands. She was Claire Winters. She lived alone. She had no family. She had come from somewhere vague and was doing fine. This was her story. She practiced it until it felt like memory. Laya was born at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday in December, in a clean room in a small private clinic with the midwife's hand steadying her, and a Czech nurse holding her left hand. The snow was finally coming down outside the window, thick, silent, erasing the street below. It took 11 hours. At the end of it, Evelyn held a 7-pound, 2-ounce girl with a slick of dark hair plastered to her head, and eyes that were still the unfocused deep blue of the newborn, not yet settled into their permanent color. She would settle into gray, storm gray, the specific gray of Ronan Viscari's eyes. Evelyn held her daughter and looked at her for a long time and felt something move through her that was not quite happiness, and not quite grief, and not quite terror, but some impossible compound of all three. The specific emotional weather of a person who has done something irrevocable and who understands fully and finally that there is no recalculating from here. She kissed her daughter's forehead. Laya, she said, the name she had chosen in Florence on a quiet afternoon, while the light was coming sideways through the clinic window, and the city was just beginning to cool toward autumn. She had not known then why that name. She knew now. It felt like the name for someone who would be both soft and unbreakable. Someone who would inherit the best of both sides and somehow survive the worst of both. Laya, she said again. Hi, I am your mom. The baby's face creased. A sound somewhere between a cry and an announcement. Evelyn laughed, the first real laugh in 8 months. It came out wrong, waterlogged, and sudden, and the nurse looked up in concern and Evelyn waved her off. I am okay, she said. I am fine. She was not fine. She was completely undone, but undone in a direction she hadn't expected. Not toward despair, but toward something that felt improbably and against all reasonable odds like ground. She pulled her daughter close. Outside the window, Prague disappeared into snow. 3 years passed, the shape of them. Work, Laya, movement, caution. Always caution, running like a low-frequency current under everything. Evelyn was careful the way people are careful when they know exactly what they are being careful about. Specific, habitual, without the performative anxiety of someone who only imagines danger. She knew the geometry of it. She knew what Ronan's network could do, how wide it reached, how patient it could be when it needed to be. She did not underestimate it. She kept her profile minimal, her connections shallow, her documentation clean. She changed apartments twice in Prague before finding one that felt right. A third-floor flat in a quieter neighborhood with good light and a landlord who was 70 years old and mostly interested in his garden. She enrolled Laya in a Czech nursery school 2 blocks away, where the child spent her mornings learning Czech with a speed and aptitude that humiliated her mother's own linguistic efforts, and spending her afternoons narrating everything she saw with the unself-conscious authority of a child who had decided the world was her subject. Laya was remarkable. Evelyn was not objective about this. She understood that she was not objective, but it was also simply true. Laya at 2 was a person fully arrived and fully present with opinions about everything, and a directness that was sometimes exhausting and frequently astonishing. She had Evelyn's verbal fluency in something else, something harder to name, a stillness at the center of her activity, a quality of attention that appeared in moments when she stopped moving and looked at something, and seemed in a way no 2-year-old should quite manage to be thinking, really thinking, turning something over. At 3, she asked about her father for the first time. They were in the park near the apartment. September, the light going golden. Laya was feeding bread to pigeons with the focused intensity of an agricultural worker bringing in a harvest. "Mama," she said without looking up, "where is my tata?" Evelyn had thought about this question for 3 years. She had drafted answers, discarded them, built new ones. She had consulted no one. There was no one to consult, and she had arrived by herself at a version she could live with. "Your tata couldn't be with us," she said, "but he loved you. He just didn't get to meet you." Laya threw a piece of bread to a pigeon, watched it eat. "Is he dead? No. Does he know about me? A beat." Laya nodded, filed it, moved on to the pigeons with the efficiency of a child who has extracted the relevant data, and is now done with the inquiry. Evelyn sat on the bench and watched her daughter and kept her face very still. Back in Chicago, across the Atlantic, and the intervening years, Ronan Viscari was not keeping still. He had known she was gone within 6 hours. He had called the number Marcus gave him. Evelyn had made it to O'Hare, had apparently gone through security, had not boarded the flight, and then nothing. He had spent the first 48 hours telling himself she was being cautious, that she would surface, that she understood the reasons for the separation, even if she hadn't said so. He had spent the next 2 weeks receiving reports from his people that grew progressively emptier until the reports stopped coming because there was nothing left to report. Evelyn Hart had, by every metric available to the resources of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States, ceased to exist. He had gutted his security team. He had rebuilt it. He had hired 3 separate private investigation firms, the best, the most expensive, the most connected, and fed them everything he had. They found nothing. He had leveraged every corrupt official in his network, every law enforcement contact, every border agency source. Nothing. He had spent money that would have funded small municipal governments. Nothing. She was simply gone. He told himself this was the point. He had built her exit to be permanent. He had wanted her to be unfindable, because unfindable meant safe. He had made her a ghost, because ghosts could not be used as leverage against him. He told himself this at 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning, and sometimes in the middle of the day, in the middle of meetings, when the specific weight of her absence hit him in the sternum like something physical, and he had to pause and breathe and remind himself that this was what he had chosen. He chose it every day. He also, on the day 8 months after her disappearance, when Adrian Lockock walked into his office and placed a single sheet of paper on his desk without saying anything, understood that he had not been choosing something else. He read the paper. He read it again. He set it down very carefully on the desk. "Where did you get this?" he said. Adrian, 43, former military, loyal to the specific and absolute degree that only comes from someone who has made a permanent decision, said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke. Her doctor's office. The appointment was 2 weeks before the divorce. She missed the next three. The receptionist remembered her. The paper was a medical record fragment, an appointment note, a number, 8 weeks. Ronan's pregnant, Adrian said. Yes, Ronan said. I can read. A long silence. I can find her, Adrian said. No. The word came out quieter than Ronan intended. He picked up the paper again, looked at the number. 8 weeks. 8 weeks, which meant by now, no, not yet. And he set it down. I need to think. Adrian left. Ronan sat in his office alone and looked at the piece of paper for 3 hours. Then he stood up and walked to the window and looked out at Chicago, and began with the methodical and absolute focus of a man who has decided on an objective and will not deviate from it to think about how to find a ghost. On the other side of it, Evelyn did not know that the ground had shifted. She did not know about the paper in Ronan's office. She did not know that Adrian Lockhack was now operating a separate parallel search, quieter than the official one, more patient, working from scraps and inference, and the specific intuitions of a man who had spent 20 years learning to follow a person through the negative space of what they had left behind. She did not know about Sebastian Marot. Sebastian Marot was 46 years old and ran a syndicate out of Marseille that had been expanding east for a decade into Central Europe, into the Balkans, into the gray infrastructure of post-Soviet criminal networks that had never fully consolidated under anyone's authority. He was not Ronan's most powerful enemy. He was not even his most dangerous, but he was the most patient. He was the kind of man who could wait years for a leverage point and not once lose the clarity of his purpose in the waiting. He had been watching Ronan's search. He was watching it now. He was noting the scope of it, the resources, the obsession. He was drawing conclusions. He was being, in his particular way, very thorough. Evelyn did not know any of this. She woke up on a gray Tuesday morning in March, 3.5 years after arriving in Prague, and made coffee and watched Laya eat toast with the focused enthusiasm she brought to all food, and went to work at the clinic, and came home, and made dinner, and read her daughter a story about a fox who lived in a city, and made friends with pigeons, and turned off the light. She did not know that somewhere in Marseille, a patient man had circled a date on a calendar. She did not know that the careful life she had built was about to become insufficient. She had been safe for 3 years and 4 months. She had been safe so long, she had made the only mistake that matters. She had started to believe in it. The night everything changed began like all nights changed. Not with a signal, not with the ominous ambient shift that movies preferred, but with the ordinary machinery of an evening proceeding as evenings did. She was washing dishes. Laya was already asleep. The city outside was quiet. The snow had been gone since February, and the spring hadn't fully committed yet. And Prague sat in that ambivalent between season damp that felt neither cold nor warm, but simply persistent. The phone rang, not her personal number, the number for the clinic, forwarded to her cell for the overnight emergency line, which she covered twice a week. She answered it. The voice on the other end was speaking in Czech, fast and frightened. A woman reporting that a dog had been hit by a car near the metro entrance and was alive and needed help immediately, and could she please come? Evelyn was already moving. That was the reflex built over a decade of emergency calls. The body responding before the mind finished catching up. She pulled on her coat. She checked on Laya, who was deep asleep, one arm flung over her head, storm gray eyes closed. She left the apartment. She locked the door. She walked 3 blocks in the damp March cold. She found no woman, no dog, no accident. She found 2 men standing in a pool of streetlight who looked at her the way men look at a problem that is about to be solved. She turned to run. She was good at running. She had been running for 3 years and 4 months, and she was very good at it. But she had Laya asleep in the apartment 3 blocks away and nowhere to run to. And she understood with the terrible clarity of a person who has been waiting for this and who hoped to be wrong. She understood she had waited too long. The first man was closer than she had calculated. That was the thing about running. You were always calculating, always running the geometry in the split second before your body committed to a direction. And her calculation was wrong because she had been looking at both of them, and not at the specific way the closer one had shifted his weight onto his front foot before she even turned, which meant he had known she was going to run before she knew it herself, which meant they had done this before with someone faster than her. and that someone had also been wrong about the calculation. She made it 4 steps. His hand caught her left arm at the elbow, and the grip was the kind that doesn't negotiate. Mechanical, purposeful, the grip of someone who has been instructed to deliver a person intact and has no particular feelings about the delivery. She tried to twist loose the way she had read about once, in a women's self-defense pamphlet she had picked up in a Baltimore Free Clinic waiting room, and it worked exactly as well as reading about something once in a pamphlet tends to work, which was not at all. "Stop," the man said in English. That detail landed somewhere cold in her chest. The second man had come around to her other side. He was older with a gray beard trimmed close in eyes that were not cruel but professional, which was somehow worse. He held up both hands in a gesture that was supposed to read as reassurance, and read instead as someone who had learned the performance of reassurance without the underlying feeling. Dr. Hart, he said that name she had not heard in 3 years and 4 months. It went through her like cold water through a crack, finding every weak point, every place where the mortar between the new identity and the old one had not fully set. She felt her face do something she couldn't control. Not much, just a small, involuntary contraction around the eyes that told him everything he needed to know about whether the name had landed. "You have the wrong person," she said. "We don't." He said it without aggression, almost gently, which was the worst version. "We are not here to hurt you. We are here to ask you to come with us. Who sent you? Someone who wants to talk." "That is not an answer. It is the answer I have." He lowered his hands, held her gaze steadily. "Your daughter is asleep in the apartment. She is safe. She will stay safe. That is also something I was asked to tell you." The mention of Laya did what it was designed to do. It contracted everything, pulled all the air out of the available space, reduced the entire situation to a single point of absolute vulnerability. Evelyn felt it happen to her, and she hated that she couldn't stop it from happening, hated that they knew exactly where to press. She breathed. "If anyone touches her, no one is going to touch her. Still gentle, still professional, but we need to move, please." The first man's grip on her arm had not loosened. She looked at the street around her, empty. A taxi moved through the intersection at the far end of the block without slowing. The buildings looked back at her with their blank facades and their dark windows and their absolute indifference. She was alone in the way you are alone when you have spent 3 years making sure no one knows who you are, completely with no available recourse. She went with them. The car was a dark Mercedes with tinted windows and check plates. They drove northwest out of the city's western residential sprawl and then out onto a regional road that climbed through bare hillside forest. Nobody spoke. The older man sat beside her in the back seat. The first man drove. Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and her heartbeat elevated and worked through everything she knew, which was very little, and everything she could infer, which was somewhat more. They had used her real name. That meant someone had made the connection between Evelyn Hart and Claire Winters, which meant either Decker had been compromised or her documentation had failed a check somewhere, or something in her actual behavior over 3 years had left a thread that someone sufficiently patient had found and followed the English, the geographic range, the fact that they had known about the apartment, about Laya, about the clinic's emergency line, Ronan. Her first thought was Ronan, her immediate instinctive unwanted first thought. But Ronan's people wouldn't have said Dr. Hart with that particular cadence. They would have said it differently. Ronan would have sent Adrian who she knew, not 2 men she didn't. Ronan would have she stopped herself. She was making assumptions based on knowing a man she had not seen in over 3 years, in a world that had presumably continued to move and change in ways she had not been present to observe. She did not actually know what Ronan would do now. She knew what he would have done then. The car stopped at a large property, a converted farmhouse behind a stone wall, lights on inside, no other vehicles visible. The older man got out first and held the door open, and she was apparently expected to observe the courtesy of the gesture, which she did not, but she got out. Inside, a large room with stone flooring and a fire going and furniture that was expensive without being ostentatious. A man standing by the window. He turned when she entered. He was not Ronan. He was tall, lean, in his mid-40s. with the kind of face that had once been classically handsome and had since been rearranged by years of something difficult into something more complex and less reassuring. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. He looked at her the way people look at things they have spent considerable resources to obtain. Dr. Hart, his accent was French, slight but present. Or Claire if you prefer. Please sit down, I will stand, a small smile. Of course. He clasped his hands behind his back. My name is Sebastian Marrow. I want you to understand immediately that you are not in danger. This is a conversation, not a threat. Bringing someone in a car to an isolated location against their will is the dictionary definition of a threat. A precaution, he said. Given who you are connected to, I couldn't risk you running before we had a chance to speak. I am not connected to anyone. He tilted his head. The smile stayed. Ronan Viscari has been searching for you for 3 years. He spent an amount of money that would fund a mid-sized war. He has not found you. A pause. I found you in 4 months. I want you to think about what that tells you about the difference between desperation and methodology. Evelyn said nothing. He doesn't know you are here, Morrow continued. He doesn't know I found you, and I have no intention of telling him unless you make that necessary. He moved to a chair and sat, crossing one leg over the other with the ease of a man fully comfortable in the architecture of other people's discomfort. What I want is simple. I want you to make a phone call to who? To Ronan. He watched her face. I want you to tell him that you are in Prague, that you are safe, that you want to see him. A beat. That is all. She understood it immediately. She was not slow. You want to draw him out? I want a conversation with him in a location I choose. Morrow's voice was perfectly even. He has been difficult to reach through conventional channels. And when you have that conversation, that is between him and me. You want me to lure my ex-husband to you? I want you to make a phone call. And if I refuse, the smile didn't shift. His eyes did slightly. A quality of settling. A slight contraction that was not quite cold, but that she understood was the underlayer of what he had been keeping beneath the courtesy. Then I make a different phone call, he said, to some people who have a different kind of interest in the daughter of Ronan Viscari. There it was. Evelyn stood very still. She was aware of her own breathing, aware of the fire crackling to her left, the ordinary sound of it, the indifference of ambient warmth to what was being decided in the room. She was aware of her hands, which wanted to do something but had no available target. She is not his daughter, she said. Her voice was flat and steady. She was proud of it. That is a brave thing to say to someone who has already run a DNA comparison from a tissue sample your daughter left on a playground swing 14 days ago. The breath left her body, not visible. She was very controlled about it, but it left, and the room felt different without it, and she had to work to bring herself back to level. He had a DNA sample. He had been watching them for at least 2 weeks. He had waited and watched and built his case, and now he was sitting in a chair with his legs crossed and his hands quiet in his lap, and he was telling her he already had everything he needed, which meant the refusal was not a negotiation. It was just a countdown. I need to think, she said. Of course, he stood. You will stay here tonight. Your apartment is being watched. Your daughter is perfectly safe. I want to be very clear about that. In the morning, you will give me your answer. He moved toward the door. There is food in the kitchen. The room at the top of the stairs has a lock, if that makes you more comfortable. He left. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room, with the fire behind her, and looked at the wall. Then she sat down on the floor, not on the furniture, on the actual stone floor, and put her hands on her knees and breathed. She thought about Laya asleep in the apartment, with someone watching the building. She thought about a DNA sample from a playground swing. She thought about Sebastian Marrow's voice when he said a different kind of interest in the daughter of Ronan Viscari. The flatness of it, the way it carried not cruelty but pure instrumentality, which was the version that couldn't be reasoned with. She thought about Ronan. She had spent 3 years trying not to think about Ronan in any way that moved her. She thought about him now with everything she had. In Chicago, it was mid-afternoon. Ronan was in a meeting he was not paying attention to when his phone moved on the table. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number, Czech country code. He kept his face where it was, said something to the men across from him, something appropriate, some continuation of the discussion he had not been following. Then he picked up the phone and walked out of the room without explaining himself, because he did not explain himself, and stood in the corridor outside and called back the number. It rang twice. Ronan, her voice. He stood absolutely still. His hand tightened on the phone by a fraction, an involuntary response that he would have suppressed if he had anticipated it. But he hadn't anticipated it, hadn't been prepared for the specific frequency of her voice after 3 years of nothing. The way it hit him somewhere below language. Evelyn. His own voice came out controlled. He was grateful for that. A pause on her end. He could hear her breathing. Something in that breathing was wrong. The rhythm of it. The quality of control in it. The specific sound of someone managing something. "I need to see you," she said. Every calculation in him fired at once. He ran it in the 3 seconds he had before a response became necessary. The improbability, the timing, the check number, the 3 years of silence ending in those exact words. He ran it, and he knew what it looked like, and he said what he said anyway. "Are you safe?" Another pause. "I am fine. That is not what I asked." Ronan. Her voice was tight now. Not frightened, or not only frightened, something else under it. A kind of fury, slow burning and very old, that had not gone anywhere in 3 years. "Are you going to help me or not?" He looked at the corridor wall, the generic art, the sconce light, the permanent, unremarkable architecture of a life lived in expensive, indifferent spaces. "Tell me where you are," he said. She told him he memorized it then. "Don't move. Don't make any other calls. I will be there," and he was already calculating flight's assets in Europe. Adrian's current location, 18 hours. Ronan, wait. A long pause. He could hear her deciding something. The specific sound of it. The way a silence changes texture when someone is arriving at a decision they have been postponing for a long time. "There is something I have to tell you," she said. "When you get here," he waited. "It is about why I left." She paused. "Not the way I left. Why?" He said nothing. "You need to know before you come," she said, "because it changes everything." His hand was tight enough on the phone now that he could feel the case flexing slightly. He loosened it deliberately, made himself breathe. "Tell me." Another pause. And then, in the flat, exhausted voice of a person finally setting down something they have carried alone for too long. "You have a daughter." The corridor was very quiet. "Her name is Laya," Evelyn said. "She is 3 years old. She has your eyes." Ronan stood in the corridor, and the world reorganized itself around him without his permission. Every fixed point shifting, every calculation that had been running for 3 years, suddenly running against a different set of variables. Every careful constructed certainty about what he had lost and what he had preserved cracking open at its foundations. He had a daughter, 3 years old. He had a daughter who was 3 years old, and he had not known. "I am coming," he said. His voice, for the first time in 3 years, was not controlled. He hung up. He stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds. Then he walked back into the meeting room, picked up his jacket, and looked at the men at the table, to his lieutenants, his captains, the men who had run his world in the gaps his obsession had created. "Adrian," he said. Adrian Lockuck looked up from the end of the table. "Get the plane ready." Ronan was already moving toward the door. "We are going to Prague." Adrian asked no questions. He was already standing. Behind them in the room, the remaining men exchanged looks that were careful and silent. They had not seen Ronan Viscari move like that in 3 years, with that particular velocity, that specific quality of absolute forward momentum. It was the movement of a man who has finally, after a long time in a particular darkness, located the door. What none of them knew, except Ronan, moving fast now through the lobby of the building toward the car, was that the phone call had smelled wrong. Not Evelyn. Evelyn had been real. Evelyn's voice had been real. The rage underneath it had been real and entirely earned. But the timing, the check number, the sudden resurfacing, after 3 years of impenetrable silence, he was walking into something. He knew he was walking into something. He was going anyway. His daughter was 3 years old, and she had his eyes. And somewhere in Prague, someone had found Evelyn before he did. And if he calculated this wrong, it would not only cost him the woman he had spent 3 years grieving, it would cost him the child he had not yet met. And those were not acceptable. Ronan arrived in Prague 17 hours and 40 minutes after the phone call, not 18. He had cut 20 minutes off the calculation through a combination of a faster car to O'Hare and a pilot who understood that certain requests from certain people were not subject to standard pre-flight timelines. He landed at the airport at 6:40 in the morning local time with Adrian beside him, and 4 men from his security detail fanned out through the cabin behind them, and he was moving before the plane had fully stopped. He had slept for approximately 90 minutes on the flight, not by choice. His body had simply collected the debt and taken payment without consulting him. He had woken with the specific disorientation of a person whose last conscious thoughts were violent, and whose dreams had apparently continued the work, jaw tight, hands closed, the residue of something he couldn't remember, but that had left its physical record on him. He had drunk black coffee and gone back to the calculations he had been running since the corridor outside the meeting room in Chicago. The phone call was staged. He was nearly certain, not Evelyn's participation. She had been coerced into making it. That much was legible in the texture of her pauses, the quality of her control, but the revelation at the end. The daughter, 3 years old, his eyes. He had run that piece separately, turning it over the way you turn over something fragile. Not because he doubted it, but because the not doubting was so enormous and so structurally significant that he needed to treat it carefully, needed to not let it become the thing that impaired his judgment, when his judgment was about to be the primary thing standing between his family and whatever this was, his family. He had thought the word on the plane and then spent 20 minutes disciplining himself for it. Not because it wasn't true, because he couldn't afford to need it to be true before he understood the situation on the ground. Adrian had spent the flight on the phone. By the time they landed, he had a partial picture. Sebastian Marot, operating out of Marseille, expanding northeast for the past decade. Not Ronan's most powerful enemy, but his most methodical one. A man who treated information the way other men treated weapons, with care, with patience, with the understanding that a well-placed piece of knowledge in the right moment was worth more than any amount of direct force. The farmhouse address that Evelyn had given him was 40 minutes outside the city. "He will know you are coming," Adrian said in the car. "Yes, that is the point. Yes." Adrian looked out the window, at the Czech countryside, going gray and flat past them in the early morning. "He could have taken her before you got here. He didn't. He wants me in the room, which means he has something he thinks survives your being in the room." Adrian paused. "That concerns me more than the trap." Ronan said nothing. He was watching the road. The light was just beginning to come up. The specific flat pale light of a Central European spring morning that offered illumination without warmth, that revealed the geometry of things without flattering any of it. Fields, tree lines, a distant water tower. The ordinary landscape of a country that was not his, conducting its ordinary morning indifferently around the extraordinary situation inside the dark car moving through it. He thought about Laia, 3 years old. His eyes, a name Evelyn had chosen somewhere alone, and afraid and determined, a name he had not been present for, had not been consulted on, would not have been given the chance to weigh in on, even if he had known. He thought about 3 years of a child's life proceeding entirely without him. First steps, first words, first everything. The whole accumulating architecture of a person's earliest formation. And he felt something move through him that was not grief exactly, and not rage exactly, but some third thing he did not have a word for that sat in his chest like hot iron and refused to cool. He forced it down. He would deal with it later. He would deal with all of it later. Right now, he needed to be cold, needed to be functional, needed to be the specific version of himself that had kept him alive through 20 years in a world that killed men for losing focus at the wrong moment. The farmhouse appeared on the right side of the road. Stone wall, iron gate. 2 men visible at the gate, not pretending to be anything other than what they were. Marot wasn't hiding the setup. He was presenting it openly, which was its own kind of statement. 2 at the gate, Adrian said quietly. 3 more on the property minimum. Could be more inside. I know you want to do this differently. No. The car stopped at the gate. Ronan got out. Marot was standing in the room with the stone floor when they brought Ronan in. The fire had burned down to coals overnight. The room was cool, the early morning coming through the windows in pale slabs. Marot looked like a man who had slept well, which was a statement in itself. The ease of someone operating entirely within their own plan. Evelyn was in the room. She was sitting in a chair near the far wall with her coat on, like someone who had not decided whether they were staying. Her face when she saw Ronan was a controlled thing. Years of practice in the management of her own expression, but he saw what happened in her eyes in the first second before the control came up. Something that was not relief exactly. Something more complicated and more exhausted than relief. He looked at her for 1 second, then he moved his eyes to Morrow. "You have a beautiful property," Ronan said. Morrow smiled. The same smile from somewhere, a practice thing, a tool. "I appreciate you coming so quickly. You knew I would, I hoped." Morrow gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Ronan didn't sit. A beat. Morrow absorbed it without visible irritation. He was too controlled for visible irritation. "I will be direct," he said. "I have been watching your operation for 2 years. I have been particularly watching the resources you have committed to finding Dr. Hart." He paused. "I found her in 4 months. You spent 3 years finding nothing. I want you to think about what that represents. It represents that I built her exit to be permanent." Ronan said, "You found a crack. That happens." The crack was Adrian Lockach. The room changed temperature. Ronan kept his face where it was. Every muscle in his body had received the signal simultaneously, and he had overridden it barely by the same automatic discipline that had kept him functional for 2 decades. He did not look at Adrian. He kept his eyes on Morrow. "Explain that," he said. Morrow walked to a table near the window and picked up a tablet. He turned it so Ronan could see the screen. Financial records, transfer records, dates going back. Ronan did the arithmetic in under 3 seconds. 14 months. "Mr. Lockach has been on my payroll for over a year," Morrow said. "Not directly. Through 2 intermediaries, which is why it took me some time to establish the relationship clearly. He provided me with the thread I needed to find Dr. Hart. He also provided me with your travel schedule, your current security posture, and the names of 3 federal contacts you have been cultivating." A pause. "He is, by any reasonable measure, the most valuable intelligence asset I have ever acquired." Ronan turned his head and looked at Adrian. Adrian was standing 2 feet to his right, as he had been for 17 years, as he had been on every flight and in every room, and through every crisis and decision and consequence of a life built in darkness. Adrian's face was doing something it had never done before in Ronan's presence. It was doing nothing. Completely nothing. The total stillness of a man who has already decided in advance how this moment goes and who has no further negotiating to do. "Adrian," Ronan said very quiet. "Don't." Adrian said, "How long, Ronan? How long before 14 months?" A pause. 18, 30 months, 2.5 years. The search for Evelyn, the global network of private investigators and corrupt officials and underground resources. All of it running alongside Adrian's relationship with Morrow. All of it potentially compromised. All of the dead ends and vanishing leads, and years of finding nothing, possibly not the result of Evelyn's excellent disappearance, but of a man standing 2 feet to his right who knew where she was and was making sure Ronan never got there first. "Did you know about the child?" Ronan said. A longer pause. "Yes." The hot iron in his chest became something else. Something that did not have a temperature because it was past the point where temperature was the relevant category. He looked at Adrian's face, a face he had known for 17 years, a face he had trusted in the specific way you trust the people who have seen you at your worst and stayed. And he felt the specific nausea of understanding that the person he thought he was looking at had not existed. "Why?" Ronan said. "You were going to destroy yourself finding her." Adrian's voice was flat. "Because the search was costing you everything, the Empire, the Allies, the respect of every man in your operation, because Morrow offered an arrangement that kept the business stable and kept her safe. And you were too. You made that decision. Someone had to. You made that decision. Still quiet, still controlled. The specific control of something that is not going to stay controlled for 3 years. You looked at me every day for 3 years, and the business is intact." Adrian said, "Your operation is the same size it was 3 years ago. Your competitors haven't moved against you. That doesn't happen without management." A beat. "I managed it. Where is my daughter right now?" A silence. "Adrian." The word was a different thing now. Not a name, a warning. Adrian looked at Morrow. Ronan looked at Morrow. Morrow set the tablet down. "She is here," he said. "She is upstairs. She has been here since 4 this morning. My people picked her up from the apartment while her mother was detained. She is perfectly comfortable. She is sleeping." He held up one hand, the practiced reassurance gesture again. She is completely unharmed, and she will remain that way, contingent on the outcome of this conversation. Evelyn made a sound. It was not loud. It was the sound of a person who has been holding something with both hands for a very long time, and whose hands have just failed. She was on her feet. Ronan hadn't seen her stand. She had simply arrived at standing, and her face had broken through the control entirely. And what was underneath was a specific kind of terror that he recognized, because he was feeling the same thing, and it had no name in any language he knew. "You said she was in the apartment," Evelyn said. Her voice was unsteady. "You told me she was in the apartment and safe." "She is safe," Morrow said. "You took my daughter. I secured a negotiating asset." He said it without cruelty, which was what made it land the way it did. Pure transactional clarity. She will be returned the moment we reach an agreement. Ronan had moved. He had not decided to move. His body had simply acted on an instruction that bypassed the deliberate processes entirely. The old animal instruction that lives below strategy and calculation, the one that has no patience for courtesy or arrangement, or the careful management of consequences. He had covered the distance between himself and Morrow in 3 steps, and his hand was at Morrow's collar before the man had finished his sentence. And 2 of Morrow's guards had guns out, and 1 of Ronan's men had a gun out, and the room had reorganized around the physics of immediate violence with the speed that rooms reorganize when the careful performances finally stop. Ronan, Adrian's voice. He did not look at Adrian. He looked at Morrow, who was the calmest person in the room, which was the most enraging thing about him. The absolute composure of a man who had constructed a situation in which his own safety was guaranteed by the very thing Ronan most wanted to protect. "The child," Ronan said, very quiet. His hand did not move. "You touch her, and there is nowhere you go. You understand me? There is nowhere." "I have no intention of touching her," Morrow said. The collar of his shirt was pulled sideways. He did not attempt to fix it. "But you need to let go of me, and we need to have a conversation like adults, because what I want from you is actually quite simple, and it does not require anyone to be harmed." "Talk," Ronan said. "Let go first." "A second too." Ronan released him, stepped back. The gun stayed up for another moment, then slowly lowered, the violence retreating back into its ready state. Morrow straightened his collar, exhaled once slowly. "I want a meeting," he said. "With your full counsel, neutral ground, a seat at the table for my organization in the North American network. Not subordinate, not provisional, equal standing." He paused. "That is what this has always been about. Not the woman, not the child. A seat at the table." "You kidnapped my daughter," Evelyn said from across the room, for a business meeting. "I created leverage for a negotiation that your former husband had been refusing to engage with for 4 years. Morrow turned toward her with the patience of a man explaining something to someone who should already understand. "I sent 3 representatives to Chicago. He sent them back. I made 6 approaches through intermediaries. They were ignored. I needed him in a room." He turned back to Ronan. "You are in a room. My daughter," Ronan said. "Now in this room in the next 2 minutes. When we have an agreement, not when we have an agreement." Something had shifted in Ronan's voice. Something had come off it. The last layer of performance, the last membrane between the controlled surface and whatever was underneath. "Now, while I can still have this conversation like an adult, because if I wait another 3 minutes and my daughter is not in this room, I will stop being interested in the conversation, and I will stop being interested in the consequences. And you have enough people here to delay that, but you do not have enough to prevent it." Morrow looked at him. The look lasted long enough to be a calculation. Morrow was reading him, reading the specific quality of what he was seeing, assessing whether it was performance or whether it was the thing under performance. Whether the man in front of him was still operating inside the framework of rational self-interest, or had moved past it into somewhere that could not be leveraged. He apparently reached a conclusion. He nodded once to a man by the stairs. 3 minutes later, footsteps on the stone stairs. A woman Ronan didn't recognize, one of Morrow's people, young, dark-haired, came down carrying a child. The child was awake. She had dark hair and a face that was still soft with sleep, and the particular bewildered dignity of a small person who has been moved around against their will, and is not pleased about it, but is not yet crying, because crying would require a kind of surrender they haven't decided to make. She looked at the room full of strangers with a child's undefended directness, taking inventory, assigning categories, arriving at assessments. Her eyes were storm gray, Ronan's eyes. He had known it was coming. He had been told. He had spent 18 hours in a plane and a car, preparing himself for exactly this. It did not matter. The preparation was completely irrelevant against the actual experience of it. The specific shock of recognition, the way it moved through him without asking permission, the way something that had been broken for 3 years lurched back toward some configuration it barely remembered. Laya looked at him. "Mama," she said, not to him, to Evelyn, who had crossed the room and was taking her from the woman's arms and pulling her close and pressing her face into her daughter's hair and breathing, just breathing. The specific breathing of someone who was keeping themselves functional through pure biological necessity. Ronan stood still. Laya looked at him over her mother's shoulder. The gray eyes studied him with that quality of attention he would come to know, that stillness at the center of activity, the sense of genuine assessment. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have been wondering about for a while. "Who are you?" she said. The room was very quiet. Ronan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. In 20 years of operating in rooms where the wrong word costs lives, he had never once been unable to find language. He found none now, nothing adequate, nothing that was both true and survivable. "I am," he stopped. Laya watched him. "I know your mama," he said finally. It was the most useless true thing he had ever said in his life. Laya considered it for a moment. Then she looked away, the efficient dismissal of a 3-year-old who has extracted the available data and moved on. She tucked her face against Evelyn's neck. Evelyn's came up and pressed against the back of her head, holding her there. Evelyn's eyes over their daughter's head met Ronan's. He had expected anger. He had braced for it. The accumulated weight of 3 years of silence and running and alone, and the specific fury of a woman who had made every decision by herself while he had been on the other side of the world, spending money and breaking things looking for her. He expected all of that. What he saw instead was something worse. Something that had been through anger already, and had come out the other side into something quieter and more structural. The look of a person who has suffered a specific thing so thoroughly that the suffering has become part of the load-bearing architecture of who they are and who is now looking at the source of it, and feeling not rage but the terrible complexity of a history that did not simplify into any clean emotion. She looked at him like a woman who had loved him and lost him and built a life inside the loss, and who was now standing in a room with him and their daughter, and a man who had leveraged the whole of it, and who did not yet know what any of this was going to cost. Morrow spoke. "Now," he said, "shall we talk?" Ronan turned toward him, and that was the moment, not the phone call, not the revelation in the corridor, not even the sight of his daughter looking at him like a stranger, that Ronan understood the full shape of what had been done. Adrian beside him, quiet and done negotiating. Morrow in front of him, patient and certain. Evelyn behind him with Laya pressed against her shoulder. Every person in this room, a piece of a construction he had not designed and had not seen coming, and had walked directly into, because the one thing in the world he could not calculate around was the specific set of people standing in it. He had been taken apart not by force, by patience, by someone who had understood more clearly than Ronan, had understood himself that the Empire was not the vulnerability. The woman and the child he hadn't known about, those were the vulnerability. And Morrow had spent months building an architecture around that vulnerability. And Ronan had flown across an ocean and walked through a gate and into a room. And now he was standing in the middle of that architecture with no play that did not risk Ronan sat down. Not because Morrow had asked him to, not because he was conceding anything. He sat because he needed 30 seconds of apparent compliance to finish the calculation he was running. And sitting looked like compliance in a way that standing with his hands open did not. And he needed Morrow to read him as a man who had arrived at reason. He had not arrived at reason. He had arrived at a different place entirely. He looked at the table, the tablet with Adrian's financial records still on the surface, a carafe of water, 2 glasses, the ordinary furniture of a negotiation that was not a negotiation, dressed to look like one. He looked at it all with the specific quality of attention that had kept him alive for 20 years. Cataloging, measuring, running distance and timing and resource and obstacle through the quiet machinery of a mind that had been trained by consequence to be very precise about what was possible and what was not. What was possible? A conversation that bought time. What was not possible? Leaving this room with Evelyn and Laia and his life intact without changing the terms of what Morrow thought he was operating. Morrow wanted a seat at the table, equal standing, North American network access. It was not an insane ask. That was the thing about it, the specific frustration of it. It was the ask of a man who had been building toward a legitimate expansion for a decade and had found the door locked, and had eventually decided to take the door off its hinges rather than keep knocking. Ronan understood the logic. He had used the same logic himself in different rooms against different men in the years, when he was still the one taking doors off hinges, rather than the one who owned the building. He could say yes, give the seat, fly home with his family, call it a cost of doing business. Morrow got his table position. Ronan got his people back. The whole monstrous construction of the last 24 hours became a very expensive object lesson in closing alliance gaps before your enemies exploited them. That was the clean version, the survivable version, the version a rational man chose. Ronan looked at Morrow and thought about the woman behind him with their daughter pressed against her shoulder. A daughter who had been lifted out of her bed at 4 a.m. and carried to this house because a man in a suit had decided she was a useful piece of furniture in a negotiation, and he felt the clean version recede. The council meeting, Ronan said, when Morrow's expression shifted fractionally. Not surprise, but the small loosening of a man whose primary concern was whether the other person was going to be reasonable, and who had just received preliminary evidence that they were. 6 weeks. Your compound in Vermont, neutral enough that my people will feel Vermont doesn't work. Ronan picked up the glass of water, drank, set it down. His hands were steady. He was proud of his hands. My Northeast infrastructure is in transition. Too many moving pieces. The meeting becomes a liability for both of us. Morrow considered Chicago then. Chicago works. Ronan looked at him. I need to make some calls, prep my counsel. This isn't a unilateral decision. You know how these structures work. Of course, I need my phone and I need my people out of whatever room you have got them in. A pause. Morrow looked at one of his men. A slight nod exchanged. Your security team is in the outbuilding. They are comfortable. I will have them brought in. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed Ronan's phone on the table. The calls stay in this room. Understood. Ronan picked up the phone. He did not make a call. He sent a text. One text to a number that was not in his contacts and that he had not used in 11 months. A number he had memorized the way he memorized all critical things. By repetition, by necessity, by the understanding that the day he needed it, he would not have time to look it up. The text was 4 words, a location reference, and a time. He put the phone face down on the table. My counsel is going to want assurances, he said. Structural commitments from your side, territory boundaries, revenue splits, chain of command clarity for the overlap zones. He looked at Morrow with the expression of a man settling into a problem he finds genuinely interesting. Walk me through what you are proposing on the boundary question. Morrow, who had apparently decided that the reasonable version of Ronan Viscari was the one he was dealing with, walked him through it. Ronan listened, nodded in appropriate places, asked 3 questions that were genuinely about the proposal and that required real answers. He kept his body language in the register of a man working through a complex negotiation. Not enthusiastic, not surrendered, just professional. He tracked the room while he did it. The 2 guards by the door, the man near the stairs, the one by the window. Adrian standing to his right, silent, done being anything to anyone in this room. Morrow's assistant at the far wall with a tablet. 7 people total, plus whatever was outside. His 4 men from the outbuilding when they came in would change the arithmetic. He needed 12 minutes. Evelyn was still near the far wall with Laia. At some point in the last few minutes, Laia had fallen back asleep against her mother's shoulder. The collapsed total sleep of a small child who has exhausted her available alertness and simply shut down wherever she happened to be. Evelyn was standing very still, one hand on Laia's back, her eyes moving between Ronan and Morrow, with an expression he couldn't fully read from this distance. She was listening. He knew she was listening. She was smart enough to understand that what was happening in the room was not what it appeared to be, and she was staying quiet and still because she was smart enough to know that staying quiet and still was what the moment required. He had missed her. The thought arrived without warning and without decency in the middle of a tactical calculation, the way the unwanted true things always arrived. He had missed her for 3 years, with the specific and unglamorous exhaustion of a person missing a limb. Not dramatically, not with cinematic grief, but with the daily practical reality of reaching for something that wasn't there and having to reorganize around its absence every single time. He filed it later. At the 8-minute mark, the door opened and his 4 men came in from the outbuilding. They looked fine, slightly stiff, the residue of a few hours in a confined space, but functional, and reading the room with the trained speed of people who had spent years learning to walk into situations and immediately understand what they were walking into. Ronan did not look at them directly. He kept his eyes on Morrow. At the 9-minute mark, he heard it faint, still distant, but unmistakable to an ear that knew what to listen for. The particular low-frequency percussion of rotors, helicopter more than one. Morrow heard it at the 10-minute mark. His head came up. The smooth professional surface cracked just slightly. The first real crack Ronan had seen in it. The first moment where the man underneath the methodology showed through. He looked at the window, looked back at Ronan. "What did you do?" Morrow said. "I made a call." Ronan said, "The way you invited me to." Morrow was already moving, a sharp gesture to his guards, his hand going to his own phone, the controlled man coming apart at a speed that revealed how much of the control had been circumstantial. "The text you sent." He looked at his tablet man. "Pull the intercept." "You will want to think about your next move carefully," Ronan said. He had not moved from his chair. His voice was the same as it had been for the last 9 minutes. Level, measured, professionally engaged. "What is coming in is 12 men. They have the property surrounded. Anyone who moves on my family in the next 60 seconds makes a decision they can't take back." "Your family," Morrow said, and the word came out differently than Ronan had expected. Not mocking, but something harder to categorize. Something between frustration and a kind of appalled recognition. "You flew here alone?" "I flew here with Adrian and 4 men. Ronan said, "I texted 12 more before the meeting started. They have been staging 4 kilometers out." He paused. "I didn't come here to negotiate, Morrow. I came here to get my family." Everything else was buying time for the perimeter to close. The room had changed. The guards were looking at Morrow. Morrow was looking at Ronan. Outside, the rotors were louder now, no longer distant, moving fast, the sound filling up the morning air and pressing through the farmhouse windows. Adrian had not moved. He was standing in the same place with the same stillness. And Ronan had been aware of him in his peripheral vision for the last 10 minutes. The specific awareness of a person who has become a threat variable, someone whose next action was unpredictable in a way that Adrian Lockhack had never been unpredictable before in 17 years. "Adrian," Ronan said without looking at him, "whatever you are thinking." "I am not thinking anything," Adrian said. "Good." One of Morrow's guards moved. He moved toward Evelyn and Laya, not with a weapon drawn, but with the purpose of a man executing an instruction, closing on a leverage point before the leverage evaporated. Ronan was out of the chair before the man had covered 2 steps. And the physics of it were ugly and fast, and completely without the kind of choreography that makes violence look like anything other than what it is. He hit the man at the shoulder, wrong angle. They went into the wall together, and the man was bigger than him and had better footing, and it cost Ronan something. A sharp detonation of pain through his left side, ribs or something adjacent, the body's immediate loud complaint about the impact. He didn't care. He got his arm across the man's throat from behind, held it. The man grabbed at his forearm with both hands, and the grip was very strong, and Ronan's ribs were sending loud, urgent signals he was ignoring. He held on. 12 seconds. 15. The grip on his arm weakened. 20. The man went down. The room erupted. Not all at once. 3 seconds of frozen tableau. First, the way runes go still in the moment between the first action and the response to it. Everyone running their own calculation. Everyone arriving at their decision. Then Ronan's 4 men moved, and 2 of Morrow's guards moved, and the room became a problem of bodies and furniture and noise, and the flat, hard sounds of people hitting each other in a space that was too small for it. Ronan came up off the floor and looked for Evelyn. She had moved. She was against the far wall with Laya fully awake now and crying. Not the sustained crying of fear, but the short, sharp crying of a child who has been woken by noise and held too tight, the crying of shock. Evelyn had her back to the wall and both arms around her daughter, and her eyes were scanning the room with the look of someone who is terrified and who is not going to let the terror make decisions for them. "Door," Ronan said. She looked at him left side 30 feet. "Go, Ronan. Evelyn, go." She went. He turned back to the room. One of his men was down, not dead, moving, trying to get up. Two of Morrow's guards were dealing with two of his other men in the far corner. The man by the stairs had a weapon out and was trying to find a clear angle, which he didn't have, because the room was too full of moving bodies. Morrow himself had retreated to the window, his phone at his ear, his face doing the thing faces do when a plan is failing, and the failing is arriving faster than the contingencies. Adrian was still standing where he had been standing. He had not moved through any of it. He was watching Ronan with an expression that was not readable, not guilt, not defiance. Something Ronan didn't have a category for. Something that looked almost like grief, which was the wrong thing to feel in the wrong time to feel it, and which Ronan did not have the available space to process. "Move," Ronan said to him, not aggressively, just stating a fact. "Or get out of my way." "Where are you going to go?" Adrian said, "You get them out of the building." "Then what? Morrow has people outside. Your 12 men are still 10 minutes out at minimum." I have Morrow," Ronan said. A pause. Ronan looked at Morrow at the window. Morrow looked back at him. "Put the phone down," Ronan said. Morrow did not put the phone down. "This is over," he said into it. "Pull everyone in now." "That call goes through," Ronan said. And the 12 men outside stop being interested in a clean extraction and start being interested in everything on this property. Your people, your records, the structure you spent 10 years building. You move toward the window steadily, stepping over a man on the floor. "You want to bet on which one of us survives that?" A silence on Morrow's end. Not long, 3 seconds. Then he lowered the phone. Outside, the rotors were directly overhead. Now the window glass was trembling faintly in the frames. Ronan reached Morrow at the window. They stood 2 feet apart, and up close the composed surface was fully gone. He could see the man's jaw working, the tight calculation behind the eyes, the specific look of someone who is extraordinarily intelligent, and who has, for the first time in a very long time, run out of moves. Here is what happens now. Ronan said his ribs were still sending the pain signal, and he had been ignoring it for 3 minutes, and it was getting harder to ignore. He breathed through it. "You call off your people. You let my men bring us out. You go back to Marseille, and you stay there for 6 months, and you do not contact me or anyone connected to me." He held the man's gaze. "And we have the conversation about the table in 6 months, when I choose the time and the terms. That is not, or I don't make any calls. And 12 armed men with bad instructions arrive in approximately 8 minutes, and we find out together how the evening ends." Ronan paused. "I am genuinely offering you a way out. Take it." Morrow looked at him for a long moment. The rotors, the trembling glass, the sounds of the room settling behind them, the fighting winding down, his men gaining ground. Morrow's people reading the room and making the individual calculations that people make when the structure they are operating inside begins to visibly fail. Morrow exhaled. 6 months, he said. "You give me your word. You kidnap my daughter." Ronan's voice was completely flat. "You don't get my word. You get the offer." Another beat. Then Morrow nodded once tight and controlled, the dignity of a man taking the only available exit. He raised his voice. "Stand down." The room went still. In the sudden relative quiet, Ronan became aware of several things simultaneously. The pain in his ribs, which was significant, and which meant at least one was cracked, and possibly 2. The sound of Laya still crying somewhere outside the door. The sound moving. Evelyn carrying her away from the building, doing what she was told for once, which told him something about how frightened she actually was. The morning light through the window fully arrived now, flat and cold and indifferent. Adrian standing 10 feet away, not looking at anyone. He looked at Adrian. "You are going to walk out with us," Ronan said. "You are going to get on the plane. When we land, you and I are going to have a conversation that is going to take as long as it takes. And at the end of it, I am going to make a decision about what happens next. He paused. But right now, you are going to walk out with us, because I am not leaving you in this building with these people, and I am not doing that to 17 years, whatever you did with them. Adrian looked at him. The unreadable expression held for another moment. Then he walked toward the door. Ronan followed. Outside the helicopter, one of his, a Contax bird, operated out of a private airfield 40 minutes east, was setting down in the field beyond the stone wall, rotor wash, flattening the spring grass in a wide circle. 3 of his advanced men were coming through the gate. The morning was gray and cold and smelled like turned earth and aviation fuel. Evelyn was standing 20 meters from the building with Laya on her hip. The child's crying wound down to wet hiccuping, her face buried in her mother's neck. Evelyn's hair was tangled. Her coat was buttoned wrong. She looked at Ronan as he came through the door, and her face did the thing it had done inside. That complicated geography, the thing that was not cleanly anger or relief, but something that contained both and more. He walked toward them. He stopped 3 feet away. Leia lifted her head from her mother's neck and looked at him. Red-rimmed eyes, wet cheeks, the storm-gray eyes assessing him with that quality of attention that he was already recognizing that was going to continue to undo him in ways he had no defenses for. Scared, Leia said. Informational, reporting a fact. I know, Ronan said. I am sorry. She looked at him for another moment, seemed to decide something. Then she reached out one small hand and grabbed a fistful of his jacket. He did not move. He did not breathe. He let her hold it. Evelyn watched this. Her jaw worked once. She looked away at the helicopter, at the field, at the gray morning sky. We need to talk, she said. Her voice was exhausted, stripped down to something raw and essential. I know. Not here. No, he agreed. Not here. Behind him, one of his men came out of the farmhouse with Adrian. The advanced team was securing the perimeter. Morrow's people were standing down in the particular subdued way of people who have been in a fight and lost and who are recalibrating their understanding of the situation. The helicopter's rotors were slowing as the pilot cut power for boarding. Leia still had her fist in his jacket. Ronan stood in the cold Czech morning with cracked ribs and the specific disorientation of a man who has been restructured by the last 18 hours into something that does not yet know what shape it is. And he looked at his daughter's small hand, gripping the fabric of his jacket, and he let himself feel it. Not the strategy, not the calculation, not the managed emotional distance of a man who has learned to keep the things that matter behind glass, so they cannot be used against him. He let himself feel it. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. Okay, he said quietly. To both of them, to neither of them, to the gray morning, to the rotor wash moving through the grass, to the 3 years of distance that were going to take longer than a field in the Czech Republic to cross. Okay, let's go. They walked toward the helicopter. 50 meters behind them inside the farmhouse, Sebastian Morrow stood at the window and watched them cross the field. His phone was in his hand. His composure had returned. Not fully, but structurally the surface of him reconsolidating around the failure, the way a body reconsolidates around a wound, building new architecture around the damage. He watched the woman and the child and the man cross the field. He watched them board. He watched the rotors spin back up and the helicopter lift and bank east into the gray morning sky. Then he raised the phone to his ear. Change of timeline, he said when the call connected. Move everything up. A pause, listening. No, not 6 months, now. His eyes tracked the helicopter until it was a dark shape against the low clouds. Find me the shipyard. I want the invitation in his hands before he lands. He lowered the phone. Outside, the helicopter disappeared. The invitation arrived before they landed. Not a phone call, not a message through intermediaries. A physical envelope, handed to the pilot at the refueling stop outside Nuremberg by a man who had been waiting at the airfield with the specific patience of someone who had been told exactly when the helicopter would arrive, and had simply been there like weather, like something that had always been scheduled. The pilot brought it back without comment. Ronan opened it. Inside coordinates, a date 48 hours from now, and a single line of text printed in clean type that read, "Bring the woman, come alone, or I release everything I have on Laia Viscari to every interested party in the network before midnight." Ronan read it twice, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. Across the cabin, Evelyn was asleep against the window with Laya folded across her lap. The child finally fully under in the deep, uncomplicated way that only children sleep. All the tension gone, the face completely open, one hand resting on her mother's knee. Evelyn's head was tipped back slightly, her mouth just parted, the exhaustion of the last 24 hours having eventually overcome whatever was keeping her awake. She looked in sleep, like the woman he had known before all of it, before the empire expanded and the enemies multiplied, and the night he made the calculation that it cost them both everything. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his daughter. He folded the envelope smaller and looked out the window at the German landscape below and spent the remaining flight time building the only plan available to him, which was not a good plan, but which was the plan that existed in the space between what Morrow wanted and what Ronan was willing to lose. They landed outside Frankfurt and transferred to a car. Ronan had people there, a safe house in a residential neighborhood, a converted townhouse with secure windows, and a kitchen stocked by someone who understood that operational situations still required feeding people. He got Evelyn and Leia inside. He got them fed. He watched Laya eat scrambled eggs with the same focused agricultural efficiency she brought to all food and felt something pull in his chest that he didn't examine. Evelyn waited until Laya was asleep in the back bedroom before she came to find him. He was at the kitchen table with the envelope open in front of him and a cup of cold coffee he hadn't touched. She sat down across from him without asking if he wanted company, which was correct. He did not want company, but he needed it. And she had always understood the difference between those two things better than he did. She looked at the envelope. Morrow. He had a contingency. Of course he did. Her voice was flat, not surprised. The tiredness in it was so deep it had become structural. What does he want? Shipyard outside Hamburg, 48 hours. He wants me and he wants you. Ronan looked at her. He is going to use us as the execution. Broadcast it. Make a demonstration in front of his network. Evelyn absorbed this without visible reaction. Then he said he had more to release about Laya. DNA confirmation is already enough. He doesn't need more. The threat is that other people find out what he already has while traffickers, rivals, anyone who wants leverage over me. Ronan turned the envelope over in his hands. If I don't go, Laya spends the rest of her life as a target. And if you go, then at least I control the room. You don't control the room. That is the point. He controls the room. I know. She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was warm. The small sounds of a working house around them, the refrigerator's hum, the occasional settling of the building, a car moving on the street outside. Normal sounds. The sounds of a world that did not care what was being decided at this table. Why? Evelyn said. He looked at her. Not tonight. Not Morrow. She held his gaze and her eyes were steady, and they had the quality they had always had. The quality of someone who has decided to look directly at the thing and not look away. Why did you sign the papers? He had known it was coming. He had been waiting for it since the farmhouse. He picked up the cold coffee, put it down without drinking. There were 3 attempts on your life in the 6 months before the divorce. You didn't know about all of them. I stopped 2 before they got close enough for you to see them. He paused. The 3rd one made it to the parking garage of your clinic. If my man hadn't been following you that morning, you should have told me. Yes, you should have let me make the decision. Yes, but you didn't. No. He looked at the table. I made it for you because I was afraid that if I told you, you would stay because you would have stayed. He looked up, and the next one would have gotten through. The silence between them had weight, not hostile, something more complicated than hostile. The silence of 2 people sitting with the full structure of a damage that was real and caused by real choices, and that did not simplify into anyone being simply wrong or simply right. I was pregnant, Evelyn said. I know. You didn't know then. No. A pause. I found out 8 months later. Adrian found a medical record fragment. He stopped. I have been looking for you for 3 years. I know that too. She looked at her hands on the table. I didn't know about Morrow. About Adrian, she exhaled. I thought you were trying to bring me back into the network. Keep me close for the wrong reasons. No, I know that now. She looked up. It doesn't fix 3 years. No. He agreed. It doesn't. Another silence. This one slightly different. The silence after the worst of it has been said when the air clears enough to breathe. What is your plan? Evelyn said. I go to the shipyard. You stay here with Laya. He said, bring the woman. He said a lot of things. Ronan, her voice had an edge now. He will know I am not there before you are through the door, and then he makes the calls. She looked at him steadily. I am going. You are not. I am. She leaned forward slightly. I have been making decisions by myself for 3 years. I am not going to sit in a safe house in Frankfurt while you go get killed being heroic. That is not who I am, and it is not what I am doing. She paused. We go together, we build a plan together, and when it is over, we are done with all of it. Every piece of it. No more network, no more empire. No more rooms full of men making decisions about my life. She held his gaze. That is the price. All of it, when this is done. Ronan looked at her for a long time. Agreed. He said they had 36 hours. He spent 12 of them on the phone. Careful calls, careful language, pulling threads from a network he had spent 20 years building, and which he was now quietly and deliberately beginning to dismantle. Not all at once, but the first pieces, specific pieces, evidence he had been collecting for years, the kind of evidence that a man builds against the people around him, not out of distrust, but out of the understanding that information is the only currency that survives everything else. He had files on corrupt federal officials, records of cartel financial structures, documented connections between legitimate political figures and trafficking networks that would end careers and begin prosecutions. He had built this archive across 15 years with the patience of a man who understood that power was not permanent and that the thing that protected you when power shifted was the ability to make others afraid of what you knew. He had never intended to use it this way. He used it now. He made 4 calls. By the end of the 4th, the specific architecture of Sebastian Maro's network, the financial underpinning, the political protection, the law enforcement relationships that had kept him operational for a decade had been compromised from 3 separate directions by people with the authority and the motivation to do what Ronan was pointing them toward. It would take weeks to fully collapse. But the foundation was cracked. Maro wouldn't know until it was too late. The shipyard was still happening. Maro still had his broadcast planned, his syndicate leaders assembled, his demonstration scheduled. The cracking foundation didn't change that. What it changed was what came after. Whether Maro walked away from the shipyard with a functional empire, or walked away from it into a collapsing structure that would consume him within 90 days, regardless of what happened tonight. Ronan explained this to Evelyn at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a map of the Hamburg waterfront between them and Laya, asleep down the hall. Evelyn listened, asked 2 questions. Then she said, Adrian. He hadn't spoken about Adrian since the farmhouse. What about him? He is in this building. Yes. What are you going to do? Ronan looked at the map. I don't know yet. You trusted him for 17 years? Yes. And he yes. The word came out with a quality of finality that closed the subject from one direction. He looked up. He also apparently was making decisions he thought were protecting the business, not me. The business. He paused. I am not going to pretend I understand it. But I am also not going to pretend 17 years is nothing. Evelyn said nothing. He comes with us tomorrow, Ronan said. After that, he stopped. After that, I will know more about what is in the room. The Hamburg shipyard was everything the coordinates had promised. Abandoned, massive, ugly with the beauty of industrial infrastructure that has been left to weather and rust. Cranes against a low March sky, the smell of salt and metal and standing water. Floodlights on temporary generators throwing hard shadows across the wet concrete. The river moved beyond the far fence, dark and cold and indifferent. They arrived at the outer perimeter at 10 at night. Ronan and Evelyn on foot through a gap in the fence that Ronan's advanced contact had identified. 4 of his men positioned outside. Adrian moving parallel 20 meters left. Inside voices, the ambient sound of an assembled group in a large space, not loud but present. The acoustic signature of 40 or 50 people, gathered with the particular subdued energy of people waiting for a scheduled event. Maro had done this properly. This was the part that Ronan had understood from the invitation, and that he had not fully explained to Evelyn. This was a performance, a broadcast execution, as he had said in Frankfurt, but more specifically a demonstration of power for the assembled leadership of Maro's expanded network. An object lesson, the untouchable Ronan Viscari brought to his knees. They walked into the light. The space was a former warehouse floor, The far wall opened to the waterfront, floodlights on three sides. Perhaps 40 men arranged in a rough semicircle facing a cleared area, the stage effectively. Morrow stood at the center with two men flanking him, and an expression that had returned to its composed professional surface. The man fully reconstructed after the farmhouse failure, apparently satisfied that the plan had returned to his preferred shape. He looked at Evelyn when they came in. I said, "Come alone," he said to Ronan. "You said bring the woman." Ronan stopped 10 feet from him. I brought the woman. A pause. Then almost imperceptibly, Morrow nodded. "Your men are outside. I know about the 4 at the perimeter. Then you know they are not coming in unless I tell them to." "Correct." Morrow looked at the assembled men around the space. Then back to Ronan. "I want to be honest with you. I want you to understand that this isn't personal. What happens tonight is a message for every man in this space and every man watching the feed about the cost of refusing to negotiate with me." He paused. "You had chances to avoid this. I know. Then you understand why you think this ends the way you have planned it." Ronan said, "I want to be honest with you too. It doesn't." Morrow's expression shifted slightly. "By this time tomorrow," Ronan said, "your financial infrastructure in 3 jurisdictions is going to be under federal investigation. Your political protection in Brussels is gone. The documentation I provided ended that relationship 6 hours ago. Your law enforcement contact in Lyon is being interviewed as we speak." He watched Morrow's face. "The broadcast tonight won't save any of that. It will accelerate it. Every man in this room watching you execute Ronan Viscari is also watching themselves become liabilities to a collapsing organization." The space had gone very quiet. Morrow's composure was holding, but holding the way things hold under load, visibly with effort. The structure showing. His eyes moved around the assembled men, doing the same calculation Ronan was doing, reading the room. "You are bluffing," Morrow said. "Call Felix Drenna in Brussels," Ronan said. "Right now, in front of everyone. See what he tells you." A silence. The 2 men flanking Morrow exchanged a look that Morrow saw, and that cost him something visible. "Kill them," Morrow said. He said it the way you say something, when you understand that the elegant version is gone, and the only thing left is the direct version without drama, a logistical instruction. The 2 flanking men moved, and Adrian Lockach, who had been 20 meters to the left in the shadow outside the floodlights, came through the light and hit the closer of the 2 flanking men from the side with the total committed violence of a person who has decided in the seconds available exactly one thing, and is doing it completely. It was not graceful. It was fast and ugly, and it worked. And the man went down hard on the wet concrete, and the second man turned, and Adrian was already turning with him. Ronan moved on Morrow. Morrow had a weapon out. He was fast with it, faster than Ronan had calculated. The composed surface concealing a reflexive competence, and the gun came up, and Ronan was inside the arm's length that made the gun dangerous. One hand on the weapon arm, and they went sideways together into the nearest generator stand. And the collision was loud, and the pain in his already cracked ribs was extraordinary. The body's loud unanimous objection to further structural insult. He held the weapon arm. Morrow was strong, not stronger than him, but close. And Ronan was working with 2 cracked ribs and the compound fatigue of 36 hours of operational stress. And the math of it was not in his favor on a long timeline. He felt the arm begin to come around. He drove his elbow into the man's face once again, felt the grip on the weapon loosen. The gun fired. The sound in the enclosed space was enormous. The round went wide somewhere into the darkness of the warehouse ceiling. But the men around the space had been still in the way that crowds go still when they are watching a thing, and the shot broke that stillness into its opposite, and the space erupted. 40 men, 40 individual calculations, 40 different understandings of what they were seeing and what it meant for them personally. Some of them moved toward the exits, some of them moved toward the fight. Some of them simply stood, reading the temperature, trying to understand which direction the evening was going before they committed to one. Ronan got the gun. He came up off the floor with it and put 2 meters between himself and Morrow and looked at the room, taking inventory, fast, assessing the threat vectors, locating Evelyn. She was 8 meters behind him, and she had not moved toward the center of the space. She had moved along the wall toward the waterfront opening, which was correct, which was what he had told her to do if the room went loud, and she was there, pressed against the rusted wall with her eyes on him. Morrow was on the floor holding his face, not incapacitated, working on getting up. Adrian was still standing. The first flanking man was down. The second was 3 meters away, reassessing. Ronan looked at the assembled men around the space. He raised his voice. "The feed goes dark in 60 seconds, he said. "Whatever Morrow told you tonight was going to demonstrate. It is not demonstrating anything except the end of his network." He let that sit for 2 seconds. "Anybody who wants to continue this conversation in 90 days when the structure has been rebuilt under new management, my people will be in touch." He looked at the second flanking man. "Walk away." The man walked away. It was not dramatic, it was practical. The decision of a man doing professional arithmetic in real time and arriving at the correct answer. And when he walked, others followed. The crowd beginning to dissolve with the speed that crowds dissolve when the central authority holding them in place has visibly failed. Morrow got to his feet. His face was damaged. The elbow had done real work. The nose clearly broken. Blood on his upper lip and his chin. The composed surface gone completely now. He looked at Ronan with eyes that had abandoned every layer of professional distance and were now simply the eyes of a man who is lost and who knows it and who has not yet decided what he is going to do with that knowledge. It is over. Ronan said, "You think taking my network? I don't want your network." Ronan's voice was very tired. "I want you to understand that this is where it ends. Not because I am more powerful, because neither of us has anything left to spend on it." He looked at the man, genuinely looked at him. "The way you look at something you understand, even if you don't forgive it. Go back to Marseilles. What is left of your operation is going to take 2 years to rebuild. Use the 2 years." He paused. "And don't come near my family again." Morrow looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the far exit. His 2 remaining men followed. The warehouse was nearly empty. The generators hummed. The floodlights held their hard shadows. The sound of the river was audible now in the relative quiet, water moving, indifferent, continuous. Ronan stood in the middle of the space and let himself feel the ribs. Let himself feel all of it. The full accounting of what the last 48 hours had caused physically, the ribs, the shoulder, the specific deep exhaustion of sustained adrenaline that had run out somewhere in the last 60 seconds and had left behind a heaviness that went all the way through. Evelyn came off the wall. She crossed the floor to him and stopped 2 feet away and looked at him. The way she had been looking at him since the farmhouse, with that complicated geography, that accumulated history, that refusal to simplify what was genuinely complex. "You are hurt," she said. "Ribs, how many?" "Unclear." She reached up and pressed 2 fingers carefully against his left side. Reading the damage with the clinical attention of someone who had spent a career diagnosing injuries by touch. He breathed, kept his face where it was mostly 2, she said. "Maybe 3. She withdrew her hand. "You need a hospital, not tonight, Ronan, tomorrow." He looked at her. "Tonight I need to get back to Laya." A pause. Something moved across her face. Not softening exactly, but a shift in the temperature of whatever she had been holding. "She asked about you," Evelyn said. "In Frankfurt, while you were on the phone," he waited. "She asked if you were coming back." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I didn't know what to tell her." "What did you say?" "I said yes." A pause. "I should have asked you first." "You were right," he said. "I am coming back." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she turned toward the exit, and he fell in to step beside her. And Adrian came in from the left, and they walked out of the warehouse into the Hamburg night together. Adrian spoke on the drive back. He spoke for a long time, and Ronan listened without interrupting. It was not a confession. It was not organized or apologetic enough to be a confession. It was more like the thing that comes out of a person when they have been carrying something at enormous cost for a long time, and the carrying is over regardless of what comes next. He talked about the state of the organization 2 years into the search. About the money. About the erosion of authority that came from watching Ronan obsess over a ghost while the men around him filled the vacuum. About Morrow's approach, which had been patient and intelligent, and had found him in a moment of exhaustion, and had offered something that looked at the time like the only way to protect what was left. "I told myself she was safe," Adrian said, "that the deal kept her safe, that the search ending was better for her than the search continuing." Ronan said nothing. "I know that is not," Adrian stopped. "I know what it is." Yeah, Ronan said you do. A long silence. What happens now? Adrian said. You helped me tonight. Ronan said that happened. It doesn't cancel what came before it. But it happened. He looked out the window at the Autobahn lights going past. You are done with my organization. That is not a punishment. It is just true. You understand that you can't come back to it? Yes. There is a property in rural Montana, 40 acres. It belonged to my father. He paused. No one else knows about it. It is not in any documentation connected to the network. You go there, and you stay there, and you disappear from everyone who knows either of us. He turned and looked at Adrian. Not because I want you to suffer, because it is the cleanest thing for both of us. Adrian looked at his hands. Montana. Mountains, quiet, running water. A pause. You could do worse. Adrian nodded once. Something moved across his face, not relief. Nothing as clean as relief. Something more like the expression of a person who has been braced for a verdict, and who has received something they did not expect, and who does not yet know what to do with the unexpectedness of it. He didn't speak again for the rest of the drive. Laia was awake when they got back to Frankfurt. She was sitting on the kitchen floor with a collection of mismatched objects she had gathered from the lower cabinets. A wooden spoon, a small pot, a colander. And she was conducting some kind of organizational operation with them, whose logic was known only to herself. The woman Ronan had left to watch the house was sitting at the table pretending to read a magazine and watching Laia with the expression of someone who has been narrated at by a 3-year-old for several hours, and who is finding it more exhausting than expected. Laia looked up when the door opened. She looked at Ronan first, then at her mother, then back at Ronan. You came back, she said. Informational. The same register as scared in the field. Just reporting a fact. I said I would, Evelyn said. Laia looked at Ronan. You didn't say. He crouched down to her level. The ribs made this a production, but he managed it. He was at eye level with her, which meant he was looking directly into the storm-gray eyes that were not a metaphor or a resemblance, but were simply his, translated into this small face with its serious directness and its total lack of the performed emotions that adults spent their lives generating. You are right, he said. I didn't say. She considered him. Are you going to go away again? He held her gaze. He did not look away. He did not hedge. No. She reached out and picked up the colander and held it toward him. An offering, apparently. He took it. She went back to her organizational project with the focused ease of a person who has received the necessary information and has moved on. Ronan sat on the kitchen floor with a colander in his hands and 2 cracked ribs and the accumulated weight of 3 years and 48 hours and 20 years of decisions. And he stayed there until Evelyn pulled him gently upright and said it was time to sleep. The years after moved the way years move when the storm has finally passed, not easily, not without cost, but with the gradual accumulation of ordinary days that are the only medium in which real repair happens. Ronan dismantled the organization over 18 months, not all at once. Carefully, in pieces, using the archive he had built, releasing information to prosecutors in 3 countries, to journalists who could be trusted to use it correctly, to federal contacts who had been waiting for exactly this material for years. Men went to prison. Structures collapsed. The Viscari name moved through the criminal underworld one last time before it moved out of it entirely. He expected retaliation. Some came. None of it reached his family. Mauro spent 2 years in a French prison on financial crimes charges that had been in preparation long before the shipyard. His organization did not survive his absence. Evelyn rebuilt herself in a different direction. A veterinary practice outside Chicago, small and real, and hers. Staffed by people who knew nothing about who she had been married to and cared primarily about the work. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She was better now with a specific quality of competence that comes from a person who has stopped managing competing obligations and has simply become what they were always going to be. Ronan and Evelyn did not fall back into each other easily or immediately. That would have been a lie. They had years of damage between them. Not just the divorce and the running, but the older damage. The pattern of a man making decisions in isolation and a woman adapting to the walls of them. They worked at it with the unglamorous effort of people who understand that the thing they want costs actual labor and who are finally willing to do the labor. Laia grew. She grew into herself in the way that children grow who have been loved and who have also been shown what it looks like when love requires something. When the people around you pay real prices, she was extraordinary, not in the performed, managed way of children who have been told they are extraordinary, but in the actual way, the way that showed up in how she moved through rooms, and how she listened, and how she asked questions that were more precise than anyone expected. At 7, she asked Ronan what he used to do. He told her as much as she could hold at 7. He did not soften it past the point of truthfulness. She listened, nodded, asked 2 follow-up questions, then went back to whatever she had been doing. At 9, she told her school class that her father used to run a criminal organization and that he had stopped. The teacher called Evelyn. Evelyn said, "Yes, that is accurate." At 14, she announced she wanted to be a lawyer. At 16, she changed it to medicine. At 17, she was running a weekend program for kids in underserved neighborhoods using her father's money, organized with the calm administrative efficiency of someone who had decided that the resources around her were tools and that tools existed to be used. She did not become a criminal kingpin. She became something harder to categorize and more durable. Decades later on the coast of Northern California, where they had eventually settled a house above the Pacific, a garden that Evelyn had been building for 15 years, a life that had accumulated in the patient way that only lives built on real foundations accumulate. Evelyn sat in the late afternoon with her hands in her lap and watched the light change over the water. Her memory was not what it had been. This was a fact she had arrived at without drama. The way you arrive at facts that have been accumulating for years before they require acknowledgement. The edges had softened. Sequences sometimes reverse themselves. Faces occasionally arrived without their names, but some things remained. The kitchen floor in Frankfurt. Laia with the colander conducting her organizational project with total absorption. Ronan sitting beside her holding the colander. His face doing something she had not seen it do before and would come to see it do often. The face of a man who has finally, after an enormous and costly and wasteful detour, arrived somewhere. The shipyard, the floodlights, the sound of the river, the kitchen table in the Chicago penthouse a February morning, the divorce papers warm from his hands. Leia came out of the house and crossed the garden and sat beside her. 40 years old now, with a face that had settled into its permanent version. Her mother's structure, her father's eyes, the specific quality of attention that had been hers since she was 3 years old on a kitchen floor in Frankfurt. She was carrying something in her closed hand. She opened it, a ring, gold, worn at the edges. Ronan had worn it for the last 12 years of his life, not on any finger. On a chain carried more than worn. He had found it in a drawer of the penthouse the year he finally gave up the last of the Chicago properties, and he had understood it was their original engagement ring. The one Evelyn had left on the dresser the morning after the divorce, and he had carried it across the years that followed. Inside the band, engraved in the thin letters of a different era, until the last shadow. Evelyn took it from her daughter's palm, held it. The inscription had been his, something he had said once, early in the years when they were young and still building the vocabulary of each other. When the world they were building had not yet revealed its full cost. She had asked him what it meant. He had said, "Past the last dark thing, past the end of whatever is coming, still here." She ran her thumb along the inside of the band. The Pacific was doing what it always did, indifferent, continuous, the light going sideways across it in the particular way of a California late afternoon that turned everything. It touched the color of something, just ending. She closed her hand around the ring. She thought about a man at a window with his back to her, and a pen clicking once before it was set down. And 11 years of a life that was not simple, and was not clean, and that had cost what it cost, and had given what it gave, and that could not be summarized in any register that did justice to the whole of it. She thought about Laia, at 3 years old, asking, "Who are you?" with that gray-eyed directness, and about the answer that had been the truest inadequate thing ever said in that kitchen. She thought about a field in the Czech Republic, with rotor wash, moving through the spring grass, and a small hand gripping a jacket, and the specific feeling of a man who has been reorganized by something he cannot manage or contain. Leia put her hand over her mother's. They sat there for a while. The sun moved. The light changed. The water went from gold to bronze to the deep flat blue of early evening. the color settling over everything, erasing the sharper definitions, leaving the outlines. A mother, a daughter, a ring, a horizon, and somewhere in the accumulated weight of all the years, between the February morning and this October evening, a man who had stood at a window with his back to a woman he loved, and made the worst and only decision he could see, and who had spent everything he had finding his way back to her, and who had in the end made it not without cost, not without loss, but through it, past it, to here. The light went. The garden went quiet. Evelyn opened her hand and looked at the ring one more time, and then she closed her fingers around it and she held it. And the evening came in from the ocean and covered everything gently, the way evenings do.